Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. As always, I am Cosmic, and I recently got my hands on the beta to Warhammer Vermintide, which is the upcoming first-person melee/ranged combat game in development by Fatshark Games. Now, I wanted to give my first impressions of the game to you and show you a little of the game before its release, which is currently scheduled for October 23rd. Now, Vermintide is essentially a four-person co-op game, similar in design to the Left 4 Dead series. The game pits you and your friends against the hordes of the Skaven in an objective-based levels. Now, the beta has 3 playable levels, 2 of which were of considerable length. The first I tried was the Horns of Magnus level, which took around 45 minutes to complete the first time round. The level design is fairly linear thus far from what I've experienced, but it does have open areas, and some areas look vast enough. Even though you cannot explore most of it, it does give a nice illusion of a large game world. What was impressive about the levels, however, was the detail that went into the environments. The game is solely set in the city of Ubersreich, and each level looked really impressive. It had a great atmosphere about it, and it certainly looked authentic and was very true to the Warhammer Fantasy IP. Now, the game gives you 5 playable classes to choose from. The Witch Hunter, which was my personal choice, fights with a rapier and pistols. There is also the Soldier, the Dwarven Ranger, Elven Waywatcher, and the Bright Wizard. Now, each class plays differently for the most part, and most of them have a mix of ranged and melee combat skills. However, there are exceptions, such as the Bright Wizard, who seems to be more of a ranged-focused class. Now, classes can also use multiple weapon sets, which can be changed in between missions, and each character has their own personality and is fully voiced, and they will interact with each other throughout the levels, talking about what's been going on in the world, and they will also comment on, as you're fighting, if the Witch Hunter, for example, who is nicknamed One Eye, if the Witch Hunter, for example, I went ahead and cut a head off a Skaven, and I was right next to the Dwarven Ranger. The Dwarven Ranger would then comment saying "One Eye, good strike" or something like that. And all of it, the way that it's presented and the way that the voice acting has been done, from what I can tell, it does actually provide a very good and fluid experience, and it helps with the narrative of the game. But it not only helps with the narrative of the game, it also doesn't feel forced in any way. I often felt, for example, the Left 4 Dead series, actual voice acted parts as you were going through the levels always felt a little bit forced or a little bit awkward at times, and in Vermintide that never seems to be the case thus far. Now, I've personally followed Vermintide since its conception, and I really like the idea of a Left 4 Dead style game set in the Warhammer Fantasy IP, especially with the main enemies being the Skaven. However, one of the things that differentiates this from other games in the genre is it's focused on melee combat. Now, this left me heavily skeptical about the game because very rarely do games get first-person melee combat correct. Now, Vermintide does it quite well. I think it still has, at the moment, a few issues here and there, particularly with the feedback. I don't particularly think that they have done the feedback quite well. You never really feel like you're making huge damaging hits at any one point. The feedback from what I've experienced thus far is less than impressive, put it that way. However, for the most part, considering that first-person melee is extremely difficult to do, they have done a bang-up job so far. However, I think that the feedback does need tweaked for the final release. One thing I was impressed with was the enemies and how they were presented in the levels. In Left 4 Dead, you had the various zombies, and then you had the special units who would come in every so often. And pretty much Vermintide is the exact same way. You have your basic enemies, which are the clan rat slaves and the clan rats, who are dangerous in numbers and they will always come at you in numbers. But then you have the special enemies. Now, the special enemies are fairly similar in design to Left 4 Dead. For example, you have the giant tank the Rat Ogre, which is basically a giant Skaven, and it takes a lot of firepower to take that thing down. You have the Rattling Gunner, which is a machine gun equipped Skaven that will just blitz you down if it locks onto you. The Packmaster, who is essentially one who will grab one of your characters and drag him away from the other group so that he will die. And then you also have the Gutter Runner, which is essentially an assassin that will basically pin you down if it gets hold of you and quickly jab you to death. There are some others, but I will let you experience them or see them for yourself. Now, it works very much in the vein of Left 4 Dead, like I've said. It is very, very entertaining in that way. It's one of the things that Left 4 Dead did right, and I don't think that it necessarily needs changed in any particular regard. One thing that I do like, however, is the way that the enemies are set out. You will obviously have, at various points in the level, you will have hordes spawning towards you if you make noise, etc., etc. Then the Skaven hordes will spawn and they will come at you. But on top of the hordes that spawn at random points, you also have enemies set out in the level. Now, it does a good job of kind of putting enemies where they should be. And I like the way that instead of the zombies in Left 4 Dead, where we were just standing around doing nothing, the Skaven are often actually doing something, if it's not just putting around a fire, or they're looting, or they're trying to get into a house, or something like that. They're always kind of doing something, and I kind of like that, and it does give the illusion that the world is alive, which is something that is very, very important in the Warhammer Fantasy IP. We only got to try the single-player campaign with the 3 levels, but what it does show me, especially with the special Skaven enemies, is that they will no doubt put in a versus mode very similar to the Left 4 Dead versus mode, where you'll have a team of human players, and then you'll have people playing as the Skaven, and it's basically a job to kill each other. And I really like that idea. I think it would be a great mode for the game, and what's, I suppose, impressive, more so in Vermintide overall than Left 4 Dead, is the single player campaign. I think that the Left 4 Dead single player campaign, while it was fun, it was essentially about survival. It was about escaping the zombie hordes, whereas in Vermintide it's about achieving objectives. It's about story driven missions. For example, the Horn of Magnus had you essentially fight your way to the top of a watchtower to sound the Horn of Magnus so that the town guard would come to that area, or something like that. It was a fairly large level. It was very immersive. It was very tense, and there were several moments in there where we weren't quite sure we were going to make it. But I really like the focus on story-driven single-player campaign, even in a game of where it's about surviving. And at the end of each level, very similar in the vein to Left 4 Dead, where you would get into a helicopter or something. In Warhammer Vermintide, you actually end up getting into a carriage to be taken away to the inn. Now, the inn is essentially the hub where you will start all your missions, and it's also where you can equip your characters and such. And after every mission, depending on how well you did, you will get a dice roll as long as you survive. Now, this dice roll, if you do well on this dice roll, it will give you loot. And this is the loot. You don't, from what I've experienced thus far, it doesn't matter what character you play, you will just get random loot for a random character, and this loot can be interchanged. Now, like I've said, there are several weapon sets available, and weapons are upgradable, etc., etc. So what we got to see is a very small taste of what the final game is going to be. But thus far, overall, I'm extremely optimistic about the full release. I was extremely satisfied with the combat. I think it does need a couple of little tweaks here and there, especially in the feedback area, like I mentioned. But I think overall, for a Warhammer Fantasy game, it is probably thus far one of the best Warhammer Fantasy games to date, period. And I think that if the polish goes in, they tweak some of the feedback, and the full single player campaign upon release is as high of a quality as it has been thus far, I think the game is shaping up to be fantastic. So that's my first impressions of Warhammer Vermintide. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Do like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you wish, and I will see you next time.
No wonder you lost an empire. Bet you'll be sick about it, Hillseeker. The days are growing dark.
These defenders were not ready. It would have helped if you manlings realised the rat men are real.
There's some knock relief, but this'll do.